Some photographers prefer to use incident readings, but I only do that with flash in the studio. As long as the camera isn't pointed at a very dark or very light subject, I find it faster and more accurate to use the internal reflected light meter. Conditions change so quickly, reflected readings are better for the way that I work. For the few times it does over or underexpose, I just make an exposure adjustment. With modern cameras, the difference between the lowest ISO and 2 steps faster are almost indistinguishable. With my newer cameras, I found that ISO 400 looks almost identical to ISO 100. The faster the ISO, the less chance of camera and subject movement. Now, my camera is often on a tripod, so the ISO doesn't really always matter. But sometimes I hand-hold the camera and higher ISOs are necessary. In those cases, I'll put the camera on auto ISO, so I don't have to worry about the ISO setting at all. And again, with today's cameras, I'm not worried about the higher ISOs like 1600 or even higher. It's better to get a sharp image with some noise than a blurry, low noise one. I usually set my cameras on aperture preferred auto exposure. Since I often have the camera on a tripod, aperture is more important to me than shutter speed because you can see the effect of aperture in the depth of field. But with a stationary subject, you can't see the effect of shutter speed. My usual f-stop setting is f4. Even though all my lenses are faster than f4, f4 gives me a touch more sharpness, since all lenses are sharper 2 to 3 stops down from wide open, and a bit more depth of field to cover any possible small focusing error. In the subdued light that I usually work with, most of my exposures run from about an eighth of a second to maybe a 1/25th of a second, so a tripod is necessary. Plus, I'd rather not have to hand hold that heavy camera and lens. On Nikon cameras, I suggest using the camera's spot meter to avoid having the camera be influenced by the clothing or the background density. Unfortunately, Canon cameras won't hold focus and exposure in spot mode with the shutter release button alone. So I use the evaluative metering mode on Canons. I don't know if all cameras have this issue, but the auto exposure system on my SLRs can be messed up with stray light coming in through the back of the eyepiece. That's why cameras either have an internal door that you can close to cover the eyepiece, or they'll have a separate cover, as this one does. What caused the underexposure here is that my head was away from the back of the camera, and as a result of that, skylight leaked into the camera, and that affected the auto exposure system. And now putting my head back over the camera, you can see that the metering system gave an accurate exposure. We all chimp or check the back of the camera, and probably more than we should. But is it a good way to check the exposure? I usually just look at the image on the LCD screen to verify the exposure. But the histogram can be a better test. For example, at night, compared to the dim light around me, this image on the LCD screen looked plenty bright. But the image was actually underexposed. Had I seen the histogram, I would have known that. I'll discuss in depth all the lenses I've used over the years. But for the Cliff's Notes version of what I use now, here they are. And this is really all you need. On the other hand, I'll also talk about some more exotic lenses that can spice up our work. Let's start our discussion of lenses with the wide end. Canon's 8 to 15 lens is an excellent lens that offers a look that most photographers aren't doing. In our quest to create images that keep us ahead and in demand, we need to do whatever we can, including investing heavily in hardware that helps us separate ourselves from the casual part-time shooters. With a fisheye lens, it's critical to keep the subject in the center to avoid too much perspective distortion. And unless you're trying to get a cartoon effect, keep body parts about the same distance from the lens. The fisheye allows me to photograph the entire interior of the car from the passenger window. I like the bending of the lines of the shed, and I had the senior bend over toward me to keep her face in the proper perspective. Let's compare a fisheye lens to a regular wide-angle lens. A fisheye has more limited use, but it can produce an extremely impactful look. These days we need to show a clear difference between us and the non-professionals. Using a fisheye is one way to accomplish that. Not only is it an odd lens with an exotic look, it requires skill to use to its best advantage. A standard rectilinear lens is certainly more comfortable, and I usually prefer it to a fisheye. As you can see, although it's only 1 millimeter longer in length than the fisheye, it has a completely different look. This extremely wide rectilinear zoom is for the times when you want to show a very wide area, or for a very pronounced wide-angle effect, yet still keep the architecture lines straight. I needed a super wide lens to be able to get the whole scene in from the base of the silo to the very top. This was done at 11 millimeters to be able to get the whole trampoline in. I'll talk about something that's called wide-angle distortion, but it's actually not distortion, because if we put our eyes as close as the camera is, we would see the enlargement of those close objects the same way the lens does. We like to call this wide-angle distortion, but it's really not. It's just the view or perspective of being this close to an object. With the subject in the center, the nose might look a little larger because it's closer to your camera, but the face won't be distorted too badly. With the subject near a corner, that part of them will get stretched in that direction. You'll want to keep the parts of a person you don't want distorted near the center of the image to avoid any stretching. Conversely, if you aren't too close to the subject, you can use the stretching aspect of wide-angle lenses to slim objects near the edges of the frame. I was shooting a very wide-angle zoom, using that stretching ability to make her legs appear longer. Being very close to her thighs made them look larger than they are. Not a good look that you can sell. So I had to slim her with Liquify in Photoshop for the image on the right. Anything closer to the camera will appear larger, and in this case her arm and elbow were closer to the camera. So you got to go in and fix those problems with Liquify. An extreme wide-angle lens is the perfect choice to force leading lines to the subject. This radiator gave me the chance to try that. Such super wide-angle lenses offer a very striking perspective for even mundane scenes. Wide-angle lenses accentuate the perspective lines that are already there. When in doubt about finding the best location to shoot in a building, look for leading lines to direct the viewer's attention to the subject. A 16mm focal length lens here makes a view that helps draw us into the subject. The relative importance of objects behind your subject are affected by focal length. With a wide-angle lens, we have to be very close to our subjects, and then the background objects appear smaller. In comparison, a telephoto lens forces us to be farther from the subject, and then the magnification of the lens compresses the image, making objects in the background appear larger and more dominant. For inside homes, I use a wide-angle to mid-telephoto zoom for flexibility and the ability to show more of the environment. By the way, in 2004, I started using 2 camera bodies so that I wouldn't have to switch lenses so often. It works very well in homes when you want to show the room. I prefer zooms for the instant ability to get exactly the crop that I want. Because I had to tilt the camera a little off level, I had to then correct the tilted lines with perspective control in Photoshop. When we have strong graphic and leading lines to work with, I like to use a wide-angle focal length. But with a subject this close, we can distort the face if the lens is too wide. So a 24 is about as wide as I care to go. Also, keep the subject in the center to avoid the more extreme distortion that you'll see near the corners. A wide-angle lens can help us see things from a new creative and a storytelling viewpoint. A longer focal length straightens the lines, but it isn't as dynamic as the more angular wide-angle view. A 24mm lens can be used very effectively to produce a very pronounced wide-angle effect when used very close to the subject. Wide-angle lenses used close have a presence that telephoto lenses don't. It feels like you can just reach right out and touch them.